So yeah, I'm just tired at this point. A little bit of congestion, a little bit of cough, but mostly just tired.
Today's an historic day.
Really?
Yep.
When I'm going straight from-
2, 2, 2, 2.
You're right.
You won't see that again.
2, 2, 2, 2. Well, we will see a 2/22/22 on February 22nd also.
Sound right. All the time. My wife, she's all the time listening to some story of the facts.
You know, Washington, those things had to change their name today. They announced it today. Commander. So I said, so maybe Candy's gonna have to change the name of their thing, because it's offensive to those people that don't work.
Talking about my wife.
All right, so I think where we left off last week is to pick up on page 33, exaltation for the Lord. So if someone would get Isaiah 2:10-16, and we'll do our normal read through and discuss.
So Isaiah 2:10-16, enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. The proud look of man will be abased, and the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. For the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased. And it will be against all the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the hills that are lifted up, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against the ships of Tarshish, and against the beautiful craft, against all the beautiful craft.
All right, so one thing to note here is as we continue here, you should not be surprised, given that it is the same author, that we're going to see the same themes come up again and again and again and again, and that's fine. They wouldn't come up again and again and again if God didn't intend to remind us of them again and again and again. So, the call for the punishment of the unrepentant is followed by a declaration of its certainty. Isaiah warned, enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, the haughtiness of man shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Whether the guiltless could hide into the rock or in the dust, the guilty had no means of escape from God's punishment. The prideful would be humbled, and God would be exalted. Emphasizing the coming punishment, Isaiah continued, for the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low. The phrase, day of the Lord, refers to the Lord's day of reckoning, or to what the Lord has in store for the wicked. Regarding the day of the Lord, Oswalt observed, it appears that the phrase must have been used popularly to denote a time of destruction and terror, and only after that time could blessing come. They needed to disabuse the Israelites of the idea that merely because they were called by God's name, they deserved his favor. God's greatness and power far exceeded even the most majestic things on earth, whether natural or man-made. Neither the cedars of Lebanon, nor the mountains provide safety in the day of God's judgment. The same could be said about the high towers or fortified walls. Additionally, one cannot escape punishment by fleeing in either the ships of Tarshish or beautiful sloops. Harmon concluded, in the coming judgment day, none of these things will be grounds for boasting, for human pride and human achievement will be humbled before the Lord of hosts. Refuge is available only in God. Our pride or confidence is misplaced if it is located anywhere else. So, thoughts, things that jump out at you here. I'll go ahead and tell you, this is the one section I don't have a lot of notes or thoughts on, so.
Well, I think if we connect it to the last class where, if we back up in Isaiah chapter 2 to verse 8, where it talks about how they are worshiping the works of their hands, this idea of idolatry everywhere, putting things in front of God. In the case of the people that Isaiah is actually writing to, they were putting actual gods in the place of the one true God. I think for us, we may idolize other things in our life, right? There are other things that we could call the works of our hands, whether it is our careers or our families or the whatever. And I think when we get to this section, we get over here and it says, enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of a man shall be humbled. He goes into this, God's gonna tear down every single thing that you are placing in front of him, placing before him. So connecting it to what we kind of sort of talked about in terms of transition last week, this idea of you people are putting all these other things in front of God. He's going to tear all of that down. It's all going to be torn down, and there's not going to be any place where you can run, and there won't be there's no mountain you can hide in. There's no ship you can use to get away from it. God's will be done, and you need to recognize that.
Something always arises with me, what date is it? Is it 2006? We'll have the other countries. Won't be wrong.
8th
century BC.
8th century, so.
So that would be the, 700s BC?
Yeah, 700s.
Okay, so what, question is, what visitation of God is this? Is this looking forward to time of Christ, designations there? So what have we got on that?
Thoughts on when this is talking about?
Yeah.
Well, I think we know that there are two great kingdoms that God uses to discipline his people that we could say might represent what's going to happen at in a more immediate great day of the Lord. Syria, and then you have Babylon. These are the two sort of cudgels that God uses in antiquity to discipline his people. And so I guess we could look forward to the way God's going to discipline these people specifically for that. In another sense, we could look at it and say, there's a judgment day that is going to be coming that none of us will be able to escape today, right now, and potentially in our lifetime. And that on that great day of the Lord, he'll tear down everything that you're putting before him.
Well, that's certainly true. But if we're looking at something, let's say 6 or 7 before Christ, and there's a lot going to happen, obviously, between then and when we are here today. Usually, the references is to the Roman period when the Messiah would come. come and the destruction of Jerusalem and all of that? Or is it looking forward to the end of time?
Yeah. And of course, you have the middle way of prophecy that applies in the near term as well
Right.
as in the long term or in the final sense.
Yeah. I ain't looked this up too bad now, but that's nearly always the question. We have a historical time in the Old Testament, and it says, in that day or somewhere in the future. Okay, when is that?
Yeah,
So you could look at the Roman Empire as being that and all of the terrible destruction of
Right.
Jerusalem and all that. Or you could go to the end of time when it comes back to the
Right.
all of this.
yeah, and you could even go as short term as what's going to come with Babylon, at least for the listeners here.
Babylon was in 607, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, the Assyrians have already taken away
No.
and wiped out the north and redistributed the population and moved new people in.
Babylon's yet to come.
Yeah, and Assyria has taken in this time period as well. Yes, Babylon's yet to come. Assyria has taken in this time as well. Basically everything in the south except for Jerusalem, in part of this time. And so, this next, what could be a next day of judgment for
That's what they did in
Israel
Jerusalem, wasn't
would
it? I
be
mean, the
Babylon.
Babylonians did
Yeah.
basically take it to the ground.
They raised it, yeah.
586.
Yeah, well, we know for sure, so 586, thank you. And we know that the walls aren't there anymore because we've got lots of stories about building those back once the Jews come back from Babylon.
Really, as Ken was saying there, it's a long jump between Isaiah and the coming of Jesus at the end of time.
Yeah,
So, but what else are you gonna put except the time that Jesus came, went back to heaven and the Christian era? Or
Right.
are you gonna look for something in the middle?
yeah. I mean, your two big points, as you pointed out, are Babylon and Rome, where there's, no stone will be left on another. So in those two cases, and then of course, are we talking about far in the future?
In view of your point, if we're looking at it as in the time, which it very well might be, then what applications to us here in this room would we apply this statement to ourselves? What is the suffering that we are going to have, or that we are now?
What is the suffering that we're gonna have, or what is the lesson to take from it? We are going to get more into those points as we continue finish up chapter 2 and move on to chapter 5 in the next part. So I'll say on that, stay tuned, because we are going to talk about some of that. And it's going to come up in the next set of verses as well. So if somebody get Isaiah 2, 17 through 22, that'll be our last section for this lesson.
17 through 22.
You got it.
And the haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of man shall be brought down. And the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. And the idols shall utterly pass away. And the people shall enter the caves of the rocks and the holes of the ground, from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of the majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. In that day mankind will cast away their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made with themselves to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to enter the caverns of the rocks and the cliffs of the rocks, of the cliffs, from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. Stop regarding man in whose nostrils is breath, for of what account is he?
All right.
Well, I think that's kind of a, I think that's.
It's not tame, not holding back there. Having described the punishment reserved for the prideful, Isaiah emphasized what the Lord would do to idols. He wrote, "But the idols he shall utterly abolish." This was necessary, according to Young, because idols were the root from whence the other evils flow. When men turn to idolatry, they pervert everything else. The root, therefore, must be done away. Rather than turning to their idols for deliverance, Isaiah predicted the wicked would go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. In the futile attempt to escape, a man will cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made, each for himself to worship, to the moles and to bats. Shackelford wrote, "Their idols that they had worshipped and valued so highly would be discarded as the worthless objects they were. At the coming of God's judgment, the people would see the vanity of their idolatry as they attempted to hide from the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty." The passage ends with Isaiah calling for the people to sever or stop regarding or stop trusting the wicked. Explaining this admonition, Smith observed, "Interestingly, the prophet's aim is not merely to stop idol worship, but to address the sinful hearts of the people. People make themselves gods by giving themselves center stage and glorifying their importance. They tend to measure everything by how it is related to or how it affects them, not how it affects God. They are important, their pleasure and desires are paramount, and everything is judged by their self-created standards. This needs to stop. As the psalmist declared, it is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man." All right, thoughts, questions here?
I just like the word, I like the mental picture that I get when he describes how people are going to react on that day, right? You get over here in verse 19, and he's really, if you could imagine a sort of a movie reel in your mind of how people start reacting on that great day of the Lord, right? First, what we're going to do is we're going to try to hide, right? We're going to try to hide from it. We're going to hide in holes and rocks and caves in the earth from the terror of the Lord, right? And then what you do when you start running, you're going to run for your life, and as you run, you do what? You start throwing. You start
dropping ballast.
You're throwing these things away that you were holding so precious before, right? These idols of silver, these idols of gold, you're just like tossing them as you run, as you're trying to get away from God's judgment. I think it's kind of a terrifying, if you can visualize it, it's I think a terrifying reality of the way people tend to react when they find themselves in these moments.
I really like the imagery, just to really put a point on it. The moles and the bats end up with the idols. That's where that's the final location for those things. There's a little bit of a certainly not hilariously humorous, but there's a barn on some, certainly a point on that.
One other observation I would make is in verse 21 and 22, there's this juxtaposition between who God is and who man is.
Yeah.
In 21, talking about his splendor and his majesty. And then in 22, what in the world is a man? You know, give up on, you guys need to just quit worrying about what men think. And I think it's ironic that later on in the book of Isaiah, we get over to 53, we see these prophecies about the one man, Jesus, that humanity disregarded, while God is saying, whoever's reading this, you need to disregard humans.
Yeah.
And regard God, right?
Yeah.
I think that's, to me, that's the other thing that I would.
A little bit of thought about this, just kind of where we are at today, how things relate. Why is the reaction so immediate and so strong from the people? You know, there's no, hey, something big's happening, let's wait and see what's going on. They're diving into the caves, into the holes, into the dust.
They're convicted.
They're convicted.
Fear is taking hold of them because
Yeah.
they know.
Oh, they know.
That they put these things before God. It's convicting.
Yeah.
That conviction produces fear.
It brings me to the, we brought it up before of, the beginning of Romans, of that, that people know by, they may not know the details, in this time of what God has done and promised it, but they know there is a God through what has been created. And so, they're, as we're going to continue to see, we're pretending to live our lives, we're calling evil good and good evil. We are pretending that things that we want to do that we shouldn't are okay, lying to each other, lying to ourselves. But as soon as God shows up, the magnitude of his righteousness and his splendor strips all of that bare just immediately. All of this charade we have of fooling ourselves about what the real situation is, that everyone knows. There's no, hey, let's figure out, maybe we can bargain, maybe we can see how this is going to play out. It's immediate. Those who have been following the idols and being concerned with the work of the creation, and so the creator and their creations instead of the creator, immediately are convicted.
I agree with what you're saying. I try to put myself in the place of the people receiving this message, and I wonder how many folks living in that time were thinking to themselves as they were putting all of these, chasing after sex and power and money, which is basically what they were chasing after. As they were chasing after those things, were they thinking to themselves that they were actively putting these things before God?
Yeah,
And so when I try to relate that to our time,
right.
and the way that we invest our time and our treasure and our talent to acquire power and wealth and, spending money on cars. What is it the saying? You spend money on cars that you don't need to impress people that you don't care about?
Yeah.
I just wonder how much of that was what's actually going on here, where it was the culture had taken over their hearts and their behavior.
And certainly.
And then when the Lord returns, suddenly it's like, oh no, right?
Yeah. There's I think, we fool ourselves, and the stories that we tell ourselves, and consciously, most of it is, the justifications we go through for how we're spending our time. We want more of this, we want more of that, we want to make this part of our lives easier. And, but there's that, for those that are righteous in following God, they don't have that nagging little bit. There's something in the background that's, as I said, I don't think they're thinking, consciously really, hey, am I, are we the bad guys? Is not typically a question asked by the bad guys. Applications here.
Well, the view of the return of God. Often when I study or in classes or whatever, you get a passage like this, we tend to go to the bad things. That Isaiah is talking about, the bad things where this is going to help you. But in the midst of the reading that you just did, we're going to see the majesty of God.
Yes.
Well, okay. Well, let's just say that the 10 of us in here, and God comes. All right? So, how much time will there be for us to look around and see all of us either in bad situations or good situations? I mean, there's either a real time or a not real time when the Lord gets back.
Yeah.
And of course, the language here is in along the lines that the Lord will come back and we'll have the events of the return that you get in Revelation.
Yeah, some sort of judgment here.
Yeah, well, how's that going to work? Of course, we don't know.
Yeah.
But the poetry of these languages, particularly in the Old Testament, but then there's Revelation, which seems to be
In a similar.
yes, it seems to be poetic almost.
Yes.
Well, how are we doing? And right in the middle of this is the resurrection. When Christ is raised, and he's the same as he was, but he's not the same as he was.
Right.
And so the shades of change through the Bible is part of, I think, the interest of what we're studying.
Yeah. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to come off with the idea that the righteous in this day are going to not be potentially hiding or at least hitting the ground. I mean, we look at examples even of, visitations of angels. And, I mean, people even the righteousness hit the ground in fear. But what they are not doing is spending time trying to pitch that idol. It's like, getting pulled over by the highway patrol and the baggies going out the side window. They're not spending time doing that because they know the righteousness and power of God and are appropriately fearful in that context, I think.
Well, have you never sat quietly in a chair and thought,
Good so far.
what if God were to come right now? What would I do? What would happen? Would I hear this big trumpet, or there's going to be this big flash of light, or what?
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever thought of that?
Yeah, the conclusion I've come to is I think I'll notice it when it happens.
Touche.
how is it exactly going to be?
going next.
There's lots of strong and intense language, metaphors, etc. that we read about this. And as I kind of jokingly said, the one thing I do not think I will be able to do is to ignore that it's happening.
I think that, if we look for lessons from this, for me, it's how do we deal with the injunction of verse 22? What do we do with that verse? How do we today in 21st century Nashville, Tennessee, when we read that, what do we do with that injunction? We are told, the reader is told to stop regarding man. How do we address that? That is a direct injunction, forceful saying, hey, you, stop regarding man. I mean, if we're looking for a take-home message, what are practical ways where we do that?
Can't serve two gods. Can't serve man
I agree.
and God.
But it's so, would we agree, though, that it's really difficult for us to ignore what other people think of us?
Yep.
No, I didn't.
Well, not for you, Terry.
Well,
Yeah.
I like what you said.
So it's got, in 22 months, it says, stop trusting in man, so it's another, that makes more sense to me. But then back up in verse 3, it's got many people, I think this is what God's wanting, is many people will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. And I think of, like, if I, on my phone, if I swipe to the left, and it's got all this news feed stuff that it wants me to read, this is a bunch of junk. This is like, here's what you should do with houseplants, and you should organize your stuff this way, not this way. And I'm like, this is it. It's like, these are all the things that should be important, and you're definitely doing it wrong. You should
Oh, yeah, I love
right
those
now,
episodes
you know?
on the news,
Yeah.
where they tell you, this is how you've been storing your cheese wrong.
How you've been doing your life wrong all this
Yeah.
time.
This
Did
is
you
what's
know?
really important, and here's a nice picture that moves, and you should pay attention, without saying, hey, hello, I'm gonna teach you, come over here. I would like your attention, please.
I agree, but practically, how do we do that? How do we fight it? How do we fight the urge, I think that part of the problem these people had was they cared too much about what other people thought about them, and they allowed other people to drag them along into some things that they should never have been a part of to begin with.
And we're gonna get to chapter 5 and dragging is literally part of the imagery.
So that, to me, that's the sort of the seminal question, is practically how do we do that? And I think what Heidi's saying is, first we have to recognize it. We have to recognize that a lot of this stuff that's competing for space in our lives is probably either meaningless or not good for us, right? So we recognize that, right? Now, once we've recognized that, practically, what do?
You have to choose what is input.
Yeah, choose what we should input, but I think it goes deeper than that. Trying to determine where we get our identity from to begin with. If you get your identity, if your self-worth is wrapped up in what other people say or think about you, then you're misplacing your self-worth. It's not just a matter of us saying, you know what, that's not good for me. I'm not going to put that in my mind. This over here is good for me. It's much more than that. It's saying to ourselves that my worth is wrapped up in my relationship with God and nowhere else. What this person thinks of me doesn't matter compared to what God thinks of me. I'm going to get my identity and my self-worth from my relationship with God. And that is where we begin the process of basically stopping regarding man.
Yeah.
We're going to regard God, and not just regard him, but find our identity there. And I think the problem is so many of us find our identity in lots of places that aren't good for us. Our identity is wrapped up in being a parent, or our identity is wrapped up in being a professional, or our identity is wrapped up in being an American, right? Where do you find your identity? And if you're finding that identity anywhere outside of your relationship with God, it's misplaced. You need to reassess that. So that, for me, I think that's the real issue.
Well, one of the problems of these turkeys trying to find their identity, they couldn't hang on to the book of law. They kept losing it.
They were chosen by God, but they weren't finding their identity in that
But I mean,
relationship
I find
with
my
God.
identity in the book. And if you go back to 2 Kings, when Josiah was king, hey, we found the book of law here.
Let's read it out loud.
Yeah,
Everybody
how
come
about
and listen
that?
to this.
Well,
Yeah.
he found it, it didn't do him any good, but they did find it, you know. But I mean, if you find the book and you stay in the book, you're okay. If you lose the book.
Well, it's more than that though, Terrell. It's finding the book, studying the book, and internalizing what you're studying. I know people who are Bible scholars that study the book but never internalize what the book might mean for their own lives. Over at Vanderbilt, we have a theology school that's led by, I don't want to say it,
We don't,
but
Yeah.
we're not on the same track.
by people who don't believe in who God is. And so it's more than just studying the book, it's actually internalizing what we study, letting it become part of who we are.
Well,
It's like a foundation of a house. The foundation of the house is necessary, but we want to put the house on top of the foundation. A foundation without a house is like the knowledge that's necessary. It's not optional. But we also want to put the house on top of it, which is the internalization, the letting it affect every aspect of our lives, our minds and our actions, and our emotions.
It's good.
when you get older, Ken, take a knee, will you? You start to realize, I mean, there's a real clear distinction between men and God.
I agree.
I mean,
And
for
I'm not
me,
confused.
pardon?
I'm not confused about that distinction.
Well, I mean, he uses the word here, regarding man. Stop regarding men. That's
Quit putting your trust, quit caring, quit following, pay attention. It's a juxtaposition to verse 21. You need to pay attention to the majesty and splendor of God. And quit paying attention to these people that
one of the
you've
things that'll
been.
help you do that, Ken, is to reach over to the TV and go,
Oh, I agree. I agree. I agree.
I finally got some family members to turn off the news.
It's not good for you.
And they are so much more healthy for it.
amen.
I'm going to read this is from the good companion book that Denny gave me to go along with this. I'm going to read the conclusion of this because I think it's a good added note to put at the end of this. Whether one reads the prophets of the Old Testament or the return of Christ in the New, God keeps reminding the human family that all of us are contingent. We live under God's wrath and at His good pleasure. The world is not muddling along until some accident occurs, a stray meteor, a microorganism. God has created the human race so that good and evil are meaningful terms. The race has the potential to be good, but it seems bent on seeking evil. A day of judgment is coming. The world is going somewhere. God will bring it to an end and judge the human family as He chooses. One of the things that this may have come up a couple of weeks ago, that kind of mentioning this stuff of calling good evil and calling evil good. We can even maybe get into the wrong spot as actual believers. What is righteous and what is good is defined by what God decides.
Mm.
And so, it's that tying that into stop regarding man. What God decides is good, and what God does is what righteousness is. And so, paying attention to what he has told us, as the lesson is here over and over again, is kind of a good thing here. We'll move on to lesson 5 here. I'm going to read the introduction, and we'll maybe get a little bit into chapter 5 here.
John, I'd like to say one
Yeah,
thing.
go ahead.
I'm compelled to say it because of the date. The
Yes.
day. Today is the second
Yeah,
day of the second month of 2022.
yeah,
And I mentioned last week, if you want to study, have a thorough study of the purpose, prophecy, prominence, and of the church, read not only Isaiah 2, but Joel 2, Daniel 2, Acts 2, and for commentary, Ephesians 2 and Titus 2. That's the more twos worth.
I can remember that.
excellent.
That's good.
It is good. A parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Its moral or lesson must not be missed. Parables use physical truths, which are often easily seen, to convey deeper spiritual truths. We associate parables most commonly with Jesus' teachings, and we easily remember his parable of the soils, the Good Samaritan, and the prodigal son. The lessons conveyed by those stories are easy to learn and hard to forget. Nevertheless, Jesus used parables to both conceal and reveal truth. This may seem paradoxical, but it is not. His stories concealed truth from those who were disinterested or disingenuous. Those individuals both saw and heard Jesus, but they failed to grasp his message. Others, however, understood what Jesus taught. For a portion of his ministry, Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables, and without a parable, he did not speak. Through parables, he taught things kept secret from the foundation of the world. Sincere individuals could discern the meaning behind Jesus' words. Although Jesus often used parables when he taught, he was neither the first nor the only one in Scripture to do so. Memorable parables are found in the Old Testament. For example, the prophet Nathan used a parable to confront David after he committed adultery with Bathsheba and arranged for the murder of her husband. Our lesson text, Isaiah 5, also begins with a parable. It describes a vineyard that was planted and cared for. Rather than producing good fruit, the vineyard brought forth wild grapes. This was both unexpected and unacceptable given the provisions made for the vineyard. Something had to be done. Ultimately, the vineyard represented Israel and Judah. Despite God's provisions, his children persisted in rebellion. Consequently, judgment was coming. Oswalt observed that the passage brings us back to the realities of Israel's condition at the moment of Isaiah's speaking. Whatever the future might hold, however redemption might occur, the plain fact was that somehow sin must be faced and dealt with. No future hope could ever obscure or obviate present evil. This message is ever the same. Yes, there is hope, but that hope cannot annihilate the present, somehow removing us from its responsibility. God will not tolerate rebellion from his people. As Jesus said, for everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required, and to whom much has been committed, of him will they ask the more. Somebody get the first 6 of Isaiah 5.
I'll get it done. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I've done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I'm going to do with my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it.
All right, so the chapter begins with Isaiah announcing his intention to sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. This sounds innocent enough, but according to John Watts, the song is an unlikely description for the real form and intention of the passage. This is intentional. It begins as a harmless piece of entertainment, which becomes a strong accusation of the hearers. Isaiah was not merely entertaining his audience. He caught them off guard. Whether or not the people expected to hear a folk song, they received a sharp rebuke. Isaiah's song began, "My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill." Young explained the song has to do with one who was beloved by the prophet. As the prophet soon makes apparent, this friend is the Lord himself. At the same time, Isaiah wishes to bring the vineyard to the fore and immediately draws the attention to it. With the word vineyard, Isaiah plunges us into the parable. He uses an appropriate figure. In the land of Canaan, where she would be open to the influence of the surrounding heathenism, the nation of Israel, like a vineyard, was in need of particular care. The care provided to the vineyard was outstanding. The vineyard was planted on a very fruitful hill. The ground was properly cultivated, and the vines were carefully chosen. The vineyard was also well appointed with both a tower and a winepress. Given these provisions, the owner of the vineyard rightly expected it to bring forth good grapes. Instead, it yielded wild grapes, or worthless ones. Having provided a description of the vineyard and the provisions made for it, Isaiah asked his audience, the inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, to carefully consider the situation. Speaking as the owner of the vineyard, he asked, "What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done for it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes?" Isaiah then described what would be done to the unproductive vineyard. The owner declared, "I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it." Smith summarized, the owner decides not merely to abandon the vineyard for a better plot of land. He attacks it by removing what protected it from animals who might walk through it. No thorn hedges or stone walls will remain. By no longer cultivating or caring for the plants, no hoeing or pruning, and by cursing the field to prevent rain from falling on it. Although this might appear to be a severe overreaction by the disappointed lover, it was totally appropriate, since there was no hope of ever getting anything of value to grow in this vineyard. All right. Lots of stuff there to process. Thoughts?
As you were reading it, I was thinking of the way a parent might react to their child. You know, I did all of this for you. I made your life as easy as possible. You had every advantage. I took care of you. What more could I have done for you? And this is how you repay me. Then this idea of just, in a sense, just cutting that child off, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to actively cut you out of your inheritance. I'm not just walking away, I'm actively cutting you out. That's the whole time I was sitting there thinking
Yeah.
about the parent who's upset like that.
I would have thought that if I get it, you read, you should.
Don, speak up, please.
Sorry. There's a real value in literature. And I'm afraid that even in the church, people only see two kinds of literature. There's the kind of literature that was foisted on you by your teachers in school, when you were sort of made to read a history book or made to read a novel. But once you were commanded to get into it, you see the real value of it. This is the real value of good schools. But in many cultures, including cultures that I grew up with when I went to school, once you get past the stage where you were kind of commanded, required to read, you just don't read that. So you either read or watch on television the story of some
Oh, yeah, I'm doing
no, but read something that you're kind of forced to. You find that it is good. But that's right, Gerald. There is really fine literature out there that I'm afraid people simply don't look at because they have so much in the way of television or knowledge or something. So I guess the lesson to people today, even in the church, don't forget the literature that's out there that is not inspired, but has very, very good application to anybody's life. And the more that people will get away from that, and the only thing they watch is the Super, then you lose what things that God has given to us that are not inspired. He's also given to us really awful things.
Yep. So this vineyard situation, has God set this situation up previously?
You talk about the Garden of Eden. I mean, it parallels that.
Yeah, so, and one of the things that we're gonna get, and we'll probably be here some next week as well, the depth of this vineyard metaphor. And part of it kind of strongly, as a witness to the divinity of Christ, who comes and seems to have a much deeper understanding of these metaphors than the religious leaders of his day did, and is continually pointing back to these ideas. Just a couple here real quick. So if somebody get, how close are we to done? Are we done, or are we?
We're about there.
Okay. Let's pick up next week then with talking about kind of some of our New Testament examples where Jesus is talking about this idea of the vines, the vineyard,
Mhm.
what it yields, and hopefully get fairly deep dive into the metaphors that are used here and then used extensively by Jesus and by his disciples. Thank you all for being here tonight.
See you later.
You're not going to sleep.